We closed the deal this morning. Mom's 40% is mine now. Don't bother coming in for your shift. Your key card's been deactivated. I stared at the text message, my fingers hovering over the screen, unable to form a reply. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the kitchen counter. Outside my apartment window, Greenfield's main street was coming alive with the usual Thursday morning bustle, but inside, my world had just collapsed. Dad had been gone for only 3 months. 3 months since the heart attack that took him mid-shift, right in the kitchen of Salvatore's where he'd spent the last 30 years of his life. Where I'd spent the last 20 of mine. I'd started helping at 8 years old, standing on a milk crate to reach the sink while Dad taught me the proper way to wash the delicate wine glasses. By 12, I was hostessing on weekends. At 16, I was learning his recipes, the ones his father had brought from Sicily. I skipped college to work full-time when Mom's arthritis got bad. I'd planned my whole life around the promise that one day, Salvatore's would be mine. And now, with a single text message, my brother Tony had taken it all away. I called Mom immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I threw on clothes and drove to her condo, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When she opened the door, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. "What did he tell you, Mom?" I asked, following her into the living room. "What did Tony say to make you sell your shares?" She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. "He said it was for the best, Lucia. That the restaurant was too much stress for me now, and that he'd make sure I was taken care of." "And what about me?" My voice cracked. "Did he mention what would happen to me?" "He said you'd be fine. That you'd get a nice severance, and that maybe it was time for you to do something else with your life." She finally looked up at me.
"I'm sorry."
"I didn't think." "No, you didn't think," I said, more sharply than I intended. "You didn't think that I've spent my entire adult life in that restaurant. That I was the one who stayed when Tony went off to business school. That Dad wanted us to run it together. Your brother said the business needed to evolve," she murmured. "That your ways were too old-fashioned, too much like your father's. Dad's ways are what made Salvatore successful for 30 years. I was shouting now, and Mom flinched. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. "Can you undo it? Get your shares back." She shook her head. "The papers are signed. The money's already in my account." Her eyes filled with tears.
"I'm so sorry, Lucia."
I didn't understand what I was doing. I left Mom's place feeling hollow. Driving aimlessly, I found myself pulling into the parking lot behind Salvatore's. Through force of habit, I tried my key in the back door, but Tony had already changed the locks. I peered through the kitchen window, watching the lunch rush. Manny, our head chef, looked stressed, barking orders at the line cooks. Servers were backed up at the pass, waiting too long for orders. Already, things were falling apart. I slumped against the brick wall, letting the reality sink in. The restaurant had been my whole identity. What was I supposed to do now? My phone buzzed with a text from Tony. "Stop lurking around the back. You're making the staff uncomfortable. We'll mail your final check." Something hardened inside me. The hurt was still there, but now there was something else, determination. Tony might have the restaurant for now, but he didn't have Dad's recipes memorized like I did. He didn't know how to keep the books balanced during the slow winter months. He didn't have the relationships with staff and suppliers that I'd cultivated over years. And most importantly, he didn't have the passion. To Tony, Salvatore's was just a business asset. To me, it was a legacy. I walked around to the front of the restaurant and stared across the street at the vacant storefront. The for lease sign had been there for months, a casualty of the economic downturn that had hit our small Pennsylvania town. I took a photo of the number on the sign. 2 could play at this game. 5 months later, I stood in the freshly renovated space across from Salvatore's, surveying what would soon be the dining room of Lucia's. The contractors had preserved the original hardwood floors and exposed brick walls, just as I'd asked. The custom-built bar dominated one wall, topped with the same type of Italian marble Dad had imported for Salvatore's 20 years ago. It had taken every penny of my savings and a second mortgage on my house, plus loans from 2 friends, and an investment from Rita Chun, my former accounting professor, who'd always regretted that I dropped out. But we were almost ready to open. I glanced out the front windows at Salvatore's across the street. Even from here, I could see the changes Tony had made. The classic red and white awning had been replaced with something sleeker and black. The warm yellow lighting had given way to harsh white bulbs that made the place look sterile. The menu in the display case advertised fusion dishes that would have made Dad cringe. My phone rang. Manny, calling from inside Salvatore's. He fired Gabriella today, Manny said without preamble. She dropped a tray, and he lost it in front of customers. Gabriella had been our best server for a decade. Customers requested her section specifically. Is she okay? She's crying in her car. I'm on my break, so I only have a minute, but I thought you should know. Thanks, Manny. How are things otherwise? I heard him sigh. Terrible. Food costs are through the roof because he canceled your standing orders with local farms and switched to that national supplier. Quality's down, complaints are up, and he's blaming the kitchen staff. Are you ready to jump ship yet? I asked quietly. There was a pause. You know I promised your dad I'd always look after the place. The place, yes. Not my brother. Another pause. Let me talk to Gabriella. And maybe a few others. How close are you to opening? 2 weeks, I said. I'm still working on the menu. Make sure you have Dad's cioppino, Manny said. It's the one thing customers keep asking for that Tony took off the menu. He says it takes too much prep time. After we hung up, I added cioppino to my menu draft. Then I drove to the bank, withdrew $500 in cash, and went looking for Gabriella. Opening night at Lucia's was magic. We'd done no advertising beyond a simple "coming soon" sign in the window, but word had spread through town. By 6 o'clock, there was a line out the door. When I'd approached Gabriella in the parking lot that day, offering her a job and a signing bonus, she'd hugged me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. She'd helped me recruit 2 more servers from Salvatore's, and Manny had quietly sent over 3 of his best line cooks. My head bartender, James, had been Tony's bar manager until Tony accused him of stealing, a convenient excuse to replace him with one of his business school buddies who fancied himself a mixologist. I'd expected Tony to retaliate somehow, but he seemed oblivious to the threat across the street. From what I heard, he was too busy trying to make Salvatore's relevant to notice that his best people were jumping ship. I was expediting at the pass when I saw him through the front windows, standing across the street, staring at the crowd waiting to get into Lucia's. Even from a distance, I could see the confusion on his face. I smiled to myself and went back to work. The next morning, I was going over the previous night's receipts. We'd made enough to cover a month's rent in a single evening when my phone rang. You think you're clever, don't you? Tony's voice was tight with anger. Poaching my staff, copying Dad's old menu. Not copying Tony. Continuing. There's a difference. You're going to fail, he said flatly. Your little nostalgia trip might work for a few weeks, but this town needs to evolve. Salvatore's is evolving. Into what? A mediocre chain restaurant? Dad would be ashamed. Dad was stuck in the past, Tony snapped. Just like you. I thought of the packed house we'd had the night before, of the comments from longtime customers about how they felt like they were home again. We'll see who's stuck, Tony. Enjoy your empty dining room. I hung up before he could respond. 3 months later, Lucia's was thriving. We were booked solid every weekend, and even weeknights were busy. I'd expanded the staff, adding a pastry chef who specialized in traditional Italian desserts and a sommelier to build out our wine program. The local paper had run a glowing review, specifically praising our commitment to classic Italian cuisine and locally sourced ingredients. Across the street, Salvatore's was struggling. I tried not to take too much pleasure in watching the parking lot grow emptier each week, but it was hard not to feel some satisfaction. Tony had made his bed. Now he was lying in it. Manny had finally come over to Lucia's after Tony publicly berated him for sabotaging the new menu. The day he walked through my kitchen door, the entire staff broke into applause. That night, we served Dad's famous cioppino as a special, and it sold out in 2 hours. I was sitting at the bar after closing, going over the books, when James slid a glass of Montepulciano in front of me. "You should see this," he said, passing me his phone. It was an email to the staff at Salvatore's. Tony was reducing opening hours, cutting lunch service completely, and closing on Mondays and Tuesdays to better focus on quality during peak times. "It's a death spiral," James said. "Cut hours, lose more staff. Quality drops further, lose more customers." I nodded, taking a sip of wine. "How long do you think he has? At this rate? 3 months, maybe less." I should have felt triumphant, but instead, a wave of sadness washed over me. For all his faults, Tony was still my brother, and Salvatore's had been Dad's pride and joy. Watching it crumble felt wrong somehow. "You okay, boss?" James asked. "Just thinking," I said. "Thanks for showing me." Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at old family photos. There was one of Dad, Tony, and me at the restaurant's 25th anniversary celebration. Tony was 17, I was 15, and Dad had his arms around both of us, beaming with pride. I traced Dad's face with my finger, wondering what he would think of all this. The next day, I called my lawyer. The meeting was set for the neutral territory of Rita's office at the community college. Tony arrived late, his designer suit looking rumpled, his face haggard. He'd lost weight since I'd last seen him up close, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "What's this about, Lucia?" he asked as he dropped into a chair. "I'm busy trying to save the restaurant." "That's what I want to talk about," I said. "Salvatore's is failing, Tony. We both know it." He glared at me. "Thanks to your little revenge project across the street." "No," I said firmly. "Thanks to your mismanagement. You drove away the staff who made the place special. You abandoned the recipes that customers loved. You tried to turn a beloved family restaurant into something it was never meant to be. If you just came here to gloat, I came here to make you an offer." I slid a folder across the table. "I want to buy Salvatore's." He barked out a laugh. "You're joking, right? After what you did. After what I did. You stole the restaurant from me, Tony. You manipulated Mom when she was grieving. You cut me out of the legacy Dad wanted us to share." "He wanted you to have it," Tony said quietly, surprising me. "Did you know that? In the original will, he was leaving you 75% and me 25%.
I stared at him. "What?"
"I found the draft when I was going through his office after the funeral. He never finalized it." Tony's laugh was bitter. Always Dad's favorite. Always the one who understood the business. "So, you decided to take it all? That was your solution?" He shrugged, but I could see the hurt behind the gesture. "You had everything else. His approval, his trust. I figured I deserved something of his, too." We sat in silence for a moment, years of unspoken resentment hanging between us. Finally, I spoke. "We both loved him, Tony, and we both loved that restaurant. But only one of us knows how to run it." He looked down at the folder, but didn't open it. "What's your offer?" "Fair market value as assessed by an independent appraiser, minus outstanding debts. You walk away clean, no bankruptcy on your record. The family name stays intact. And what happens to Lucia's?" "I'll keep it. Different concept, different market segment. The town's big enough for both if they're run right." Tony finally opened the folder, scanning the numbers. I watched his face as the reality sank in. The offer was low, insultingly low, given what the restaurant had been worth a year ago. But it was more than he'd get if he continued on his current path. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" he asked, looking up. "Open across the street, steal my staff, drive me into the ground, then buy me out for pennies on the dollar." I met his gaze steadily. "I planned to take back what was rightfully mine." He closed the folder and stood up. "I need to think about it." "You have until the end of the week," I said. "After that, I'll use the money to expand Lucia's instead." As he reached the door, I called after him. "Tony." He paused but didn't turn around. "Dad would have wanted us to work together. That option's still on the table. Manager's position, minor ownership stake. If you're interested." His shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought he might turn around. But then, he walked out without another word. 3 days later, my lawyer called to say Tony had accepted the offer. A week after that, I stood in the empty dining room of Salvatore's, keys in hand, sole owner at last. The place looked sad, abandoned. Tony had taken some of the newer equipment and decor, leaving behind the original fixtures, the ones that held the real soul of the place. I ran my hand along the old mahogany bar where Dad had taught me to make his signature Negroni. I stood in the kitchen where I'd learned to roll pasta by hand, where I'd bandaged my first burn, where I'd spent countless hours creating meals that brought joy to others. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see Mom standing there, hesitant.
Tony told me you bought it, she said.
Said I should come see you.
I nodded, surprised.
I didn't think he'd tell you. She walked slowly into the room, looking around at the space that had been our family's home away from home for decades. He also told me what he did, how he manipulated me. Her voice broke.
I'm so sorry, Lucia.
I failed you. I crossed the room and took her hands. You didn't fail me, Mom. You were grieving. We all were. What will you do with this place now? You already have Lucia's. I smiled. I'm reopening it as Salvatore's. The original Salvatore's, just like Dad ran it. I led her to the center of the dining room. Lucia's will focus on modern Italian, regional specialties, a younger crowd. This place will be classic Italian-American, Dad's recipes, the traditional experience that people missed. And Tony, she asked quietly.
That's up to him, I said.
I offered him a job, a stake in the business. He hasn't responded. She nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Your father would be proud of you, you know. Not just for the business, but for offering your brother a way back. I'm not sure he'll take it. Give him time, she said. Pride is a hard thing to swallow. We walked through the restaurant together, making plans for the reopening. As we stepped outside, I looked across the street at Lucia's, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, its patio filled with happy customers. Then I looked at the darkened windows of Salvatore's, waiting to be brought back to life. Mom squeezed my hand. It's going to be beautiful. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over me.
Yes.
Yes, it is. 7 months later, both restaurants were thriving. I split my time between them, overseeing operations, but letting my managers handle the day-to-day details. Manny ran the kitchen at Salvatore's, restored to its former glory with the original menu and approach that had made it successful for decades. Gabriella managed the front of house at Lucia's, bringing her warmth and efficiency to the more contemporary concept. I was in the office at Salvatore's, going over invoices, when there was a knock at the door. I looked up to see Tony standing there, looking more like himself than he had in over a year. The dark circles were gone, and he'd regained the weight he'd lost. Got a minute? He asked. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sure. He sat down, looking uncomfortable. I've been thinking about your offer. It's still open, I said. Though some terms might need adjusting, given how much time has passed. He nodded. I've been working as a consultant for a restaurant group in Pittsburgh, learning the business from a different angle. And I think I understand now what I did wrong. With Salvatore's with you. He met my eyes.
I'm sorry, Lucia.
I was jealous, and I was arrogant, and I hurt you. Hurt the legacy Dad built. I studied him, looking for sincerity and finding it. Apology accepted. He looked surprised at the ease of my forgiveness. Just like that? We're family, Tony. And life's too short. He glanced around the office. Dad's old office, now mine. So, about that job offer? Management position at Lucia's, I said. You've got the business education I never got, and now you have some real-world experience too. I could use someone who understands the financial side better than I do. And ownership? 5% to start. Opportunity to earn more based on performance and loyalty. He considered this, then nodded. When can I start? Monday. 9 a.m. staff meeting. I stood up and extended my hand. Don't be late. He shook my hand, then pulled me into an unexpected hug. Thank you, he whispered. After he left, I walked into the dining room of Salvatore's. The dinner service was in full swing, the tables filled with families and couples enjoying the food Dad had perfected over decades. Through the front windows, I could see Lucia's across the street, equally busy, its more modern approach attracting a different but complementary clientele. I felt Dad's presence then, in the recipes being prepared in the kitchen, in the layout of the dining room he designed, in the relationships with customers he'd cultivated over years. And I knew that wherever he was proud, not just of the restaurants, but of the fact that his children had found their way back to each other. I'd gotten my revenge, yes. But more importantly, I'd restored what mattered. The legacy, the family, the future. And that was the sweetest victory of all.